since his seminal work, ever since, sorry, I was distracted there by the notation that the meeting is being recorded. Members can feel confident that their comments and questions at the end won't be recorded, but Thomas has very graciously allowed us to record his lecture and to subsequently place it on the SOTS website. Let me continue then that ever since Thomas's seminal work on the fathers of ancient Israel and his widely influential work on the so-called Deuteronomistic history, the Römer perspective on such questions as the formation of the Pentateuch and beyond must be consulted by anyone working in these areas of our discipline of Old Testament study. In this vein, we now eagerly anticipate this evening's lecture on the question of wisdom influence in the composition of the Joseph narrative.
Okay, is it working? Can you see the slides?
Yes, that's coming through splendidly.
Very well. Okay, so thank you very much and good evening to everybody. Happy New Year to everybody. It's my pleasure to be back to a SOTS meeting. Also, it's online, and I'm very thankful to the president for inviting me to giving this lecture. It's a pleasure also to see also, if it's only by Zoom, very well-known faces of colleagues and friends. And so thank you for staying so long. Here's even a little bit longer because it's already like 8:15 here in Paris. So for this evening lecture, I have chosen to speak about the Joseph narrative. It's a wonderful but also much disputed text. And more precisely about the question whether we can qualify this literature as a wisdom literature. And this was inspired to me by the website of our president, who said that he's mainly interested in wisdom questions of the Hebrew Bible. So I hope he will not be too disappointed of what will come out of this lecture. So in his contribution to the what was in 1953 Congress of the International Organization of the Old Testament Scholars, in Gerhard von Rath presented a paper that was called Josefs Geschichte und ältere Chokma. In this paper, he argued that the Joseph narrative should be understood as a didactic wisdom narrative. According to Gerhard von Rath, older wisdom, which he founds in Proverbs 10-24, was located in the royal court, and its aim was to educate young people who should become skillful servants of the king. The Joseph novella would then reflect the context of the Solomonic Enlightenment, during which Israel was in contact with Egypt and developed its own wisdom traditions. Von Rath understood the Joseph story as a narrative application of Proverbs 22:29. You have seen the one who is skillful in his work, he will serve kings. But also of the maxims of Tahuteb 27, if you are as a man of excellence, sitting in the council of his master, rally every heart to excellence. Your silence is more benefit than creeping talk. You should say what you know how to explain. Von Rath further considered the story of Joseph and the Egyptian wife as eine ad hoc verfasste Beispielserzählung zu den Mahnungen der Weisen, as a story just written to underline the exhortations of the wise men. So the message of the Joseph story, with many other von Rath, 50-20 to be the summary of the message of the Joseph narrative. You intended to do bad things to me. God intended it for good, and understands this phrase as a wisdom sentence, which comes very close to Proverbs 20:24. From Yahweh comes guidance of the strong, and the human how could he understand his own way? And also to the instructions of Amenemope. The words men say are one thing, the deeds and of the gods are another. So von Rath's understanding, of the Joseph story has been followed by some, but there were also critiques, especially by Donald Redford, who has noted that except Genesis 39, which we will see is an addition to the original narrative, and two other texts which also belongs to later layers, he says there's no reason to believe that the story per se originated in or belongs to the sphere of wisdom literature. Redford admitted that Joseph and other biblical and Egyptian literary figures, and I quote, do resemble the paragon of virtue described by wisdom literature, but this is surely to be ascribed to a very common human ideal, widely disseminated throughout all strata of ancient Near Eastern society. Very few scholars would today assigning the Joseph narrative to the reign of Solomon. We had just a very interesting discussion about archaeology and the Bible. And I think here archaeology has shown us that the Solomonic kingdom as described in the Bible is more wishful thinking than archaeological reality. But this I will keep not as the main topic of my talk. Today, there's a discussion how to date the Joseph story. Some scholars advocate a setting during the monarchic times in the Northern Kingdom as Blum, Weingart, and Rainer Alberts. According to these scholars, we should understand the Joseph story as having as main theme the question of dominion. And this is an idea that was already advocated by Frank Krüsemann. So the idea of Blum and his student Kirsten Weingart is the idea that the question of the brothers in 37:8, are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us? Indicates that the theme of the narrative is Joseph's kingdom in Israel. So according to Kirsten Weingart, one should read the Joseph narrative as a Ringen Benjamin, a struggle about Benjamin. So the question, according to Weingart, is therefore not whether Benjamin belongs to Joseph, but how he comes to Joseph. So for these authors, the Joseph narrative is not much about wisdom. It's a political propaganda for the Israelite kingdom. The question when exactly is not really addressed, but the idea is that the Joseph narratives want to show that Benjamin belongs to Joseph, that means to Israel. However, this kind of historical allegory is problematic. I think this is a more general problem when we date biblical texts. We only find some historical allegories, and this makes things sometimes very tricky things. But if he wants to read the story as a conflict about Benjamin, we could also, and perhaps should even think about the situation after 722 BC, when Benjamin came to Judah. In my view, a close reading of the Joseph story reveals a rather different role for Benjamin. The question is not at all, in my view, if you read the Joseph story, whether Benjamin belongs to Israel or to Judah, but rather how the brothers will behave towards him. He also uses plot symmetry and constructs Benjamin as a second Joseph. He becomes a new preferred son of Jacob. He's also singled out by Joseph, who gives him a much bigger portion of food, but then accuses him to be a thief. But in contrast to what the brothers did to Joseph, however, they accept Jacob's and Joseph's preferential treatment of Benjamin and even stand in solidarity when the latter is accused by Joseph. So this change of behavior then leads to the reconciliation that is described in chapter 45. The plot is therefore not about the destiny of Benjamin per se, but about the possible reconciliation of the whole family. A northern setting and a pre-exilic date for the Joseph story also fails to give a satisfying explanation for the forced descent of Joseph to Egypt and for the fact that Joseph stays there until his death. If the Joseph story is indeed political propaganda as claimed by Weingart for the Northern Kingdom, why should one locate the story in Egypt and leave the hero in this land at the end of the story? For Weingart, it shows that the Joseph narrative was conceived from the very beginning as a Zwischenstück zwischen Erzelternerzählung and Exodus, as a link between the patriarchal narrative and the Exodus narrative, but this is an assumption difficult to maintain. There's no doubt that the author of the narrative is keen to give details about Egyptian names and customs, and even attributes a cup of divination to Joseph. I'll come back to this cup of divination in a while. But if narrative necessity is the only reason for the location of the story in Egypt, why should then the author tell us that Joseph married the daughter of an Egyptian priest and that two of his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, are half Egyptian? Or why would he relate the fact that Joseph was embalmed like an Egyptian high officer after his death? We have here some nice example of embalmment from the Roman and from already the Ptolemean Roman time. That means that this was quite common practice even in late times. So you see where I want to come. I don't think that we should locate the Joseph story in the Northern Kingdom of the 8th or 7th century or the 8th century. So I think we should consider the Joseph narrative as a diaspora novella, and Meinhold was one of the first to suggest this theory. He noticed the structural parallels in the stories of Esther, Daniel 2-6, and Genesis 37-15. His proposal is being increasingly accepted in scholarship and offers, in my view, a good model to explain almost all features of the original narrative. Even the northern connections fit perfectly into such an understanding of the Joseph story. And one could argue with Matthew Guénon, you have his reference in the slide, that the Joseph story was composed in Samaria, nonetheless in communication with the Egyptian diaspora community, written as an independent narrative after P and before, of course, that's to Egypt. Nevertheless, it's also possible that the Joseph story originated in the diaspora. One could, for instance, locate the author of the story in Elephantine, a colony that may have had northern origins. Also, this Aramaic-speaking and writing community was mainly composed of soldiers, mercenaries, and peasants. There's evidence of literacy, as shown by the significant number of administrative and economic documents in addition to the Aramaic version of the Achika story. But still, there is also another possibility to locate the Joseph story, that is in the Delta, which would also fit the northern character of Joseph. According to Flavius Josephus, there were Samaritans living in Egypt during the Hellenistic times, and maybe even since the end of the Persian era, as we have in the Antiquities 11. Josephus also reports that under Ptolemy VI, there was a conflict between Jews and Samaritans living together in Alexandria over the question of whether the temple of Jerusalem or the sanctuary at Gerizim had been built according to the prescriptions of the Torah. Of course, Andronicus, speaking for the Jerusalem, persuaded, according to Flavius, the king to decide that the temple in Jerusalem had been built in accordance with the laws of Moses. What is interesting in this note is that those tension between Judeans and Samaritans arose only in the 2nd century BCE. So we might assume that there was a quite peaceful cohabitation of both groups in Egypt in the late Persian and early Hellenistic times. If this were the case, the Joseph story could have originated in such a Samaritan Judean diaspora context. The northern Joseph, who reconciles with his southern brothers, especially Judah, which is one of the major themes of the narrative, may then reflect a cohabitation between the authorities of Samaria and Jerusalem. The documentation from Elephantine shows that the Israelite Judean diaspora living there wrote simultaneously to the governors of Jerusalem and of Samaria concerning the question of the rebuilding of the Yahweh temple that had been destroyed by the Egyptians. And they received as an answer a common answer of Bagavaya, the governor of Judah, and of Delaiah, the son of the governor of Samaria, Sanballat. This again suggests a friendly relationship between Samaria and Jerusalem at the end of the 5th century BCE, at a time where the sanctuary of Gerizim already existed. Apparently, the Yahweh worshippers in Elephantine thought that the leaders of Judah and Samaria both had influence over the rebuilding of the Yahweh sanctuary and other cultic concerns. So these observations indicate a close collaboration between Jerusalem and Samaria, between the north and the south, that may also be reflected in the Joseph narrative. The theme of the Joseph story also fits a pan-Israelite ideology corresponding to post-exilic prophetic texts that wish a gathering of the north and the south, a restoration of Joseph and Judah, as for instance Ezekiel 37:19 or Zechariah 10:6. Another point on which recent research is increasingly coming to sort of agreement is forfeiting the idea to reconstruct two parallel sources in the Joseph story, a separate Yahwistic and Elohistic source. The many doublets that occur in the Joseph story are either part of the narrative construction or can be explained with the theory of several redactional layers. There is some agreement about the assumptions that chapter 38, 46 to 48, and 49 are not an original part of the Joseph story. Genesis 38 is a story about Judah and Tamar, who, in contrast to the Joseph narrative, Judah is already a quite old and married man. The tribal sentences in Genesis 49 were initially unrelated to the Joseph's narrative, and Genesis 46 and 48 are inserts aiming to strengthen the links with the foregoing patriarchal narratives and to prepare for the Exodus story. And finally, the passage where Joseph invents capitalism and makes the Egyptians into slaves of Pharaoh in 47:13 to 26 is also an addition. It does not fit well with the context of the Joseph narrative, does not mention Joseph's brothers, and even contradicts Joseph's advice to Pharaoh, as well as his actions that are described in 41:25 to 56. Then also the end of the story, 50:24 to 25, are certainly related to later layers. We can see here, if you like, a Pentateuchal and a hexateuchal redaction. In 24, Joseph is quoting the land sermon that was done to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is exactly what is repeated in Deuteronomy 34. So we have kind of a frame on the Pentateuch. And in 25, the idea of Joseph's bones that have to be taken during the Exodus and buried in Shechem, this is something that is accomplished at the end of the book of Joshua in 24:32, where the bones of Joseph were buried at Shechem. And so we have here probably a hexateuchal redaction. A more complicated question is the competition between Reuben and Judah, the main characters and spokesmen of Joseph's brothers. This competition has often led to the assumption that one should distinguish between a Reuben version and a Judah version in the Joseph narrative, or that the original story contained only Reuben and then was later revised with the introduction of Judah in order to present the Joseph narrative as a story showing the reconciliation between the north, Joseph, and the south, Judah. But another option is also possible, and you have some bibliography on the screen. The Judah layer belonged to the original story because his personal guarantee as well as his speech in 44, 18 to 34, are necessary for the scene of reconciliation that is related in chapter Genesis 44. So the Reuben layer would then have been added by a later redactor who wanted to clear all brothers of blame by presenting a positive image of the firstborn. As several authors have noted, however, it is not easy to reconstruct one story that contains only the intervention either of Reuben or of Judah, so maybe that's not the best solution. One could perhaps explain the shift from Reuben to Judah in a way similar to the beginning of the book of Numbers. In Numbers 1 to 2, the census of Israel tribes starts with the tribe of Reuben, which is logic because he's the firstborn. But then, when it comes to the organization of the camp, the east side, which is led by Judah, is mentioned first, which is a subtle way to emphasize Judah's importance. The Joseph narrative may be crafted along similar lines. The author presupposes an audience familiar with the list of the 12 tribes of Jacob's 12 sons, according to which Reuben is, of course, the firstborn. As a firstborn, he has to play an important role. Yet the author also wanted to show the importance of Judah, who ends up becoming an even more central figure than Reuben. So I think we can imagine that there were Reuben and Judah in the first edition of the Joseph narrative, with this idea of a shift from Reuben to Judah. Another disputed chapter is a story about Joseph's seduction by the Egyptian wife. And this chapter will play a major role in the discussion about wisdom motives and influences in the Joseph narrative. I will come back to this question in a moment. The question of the link between the Joseph story and wisdom has been taken up recently again by an article of Christoph Levin, the title of which takes up von Rath's 1953 piece, Transforming the Older Wisdom into Late Wisdom. So the title of Levin's article is Josefs Geschichte und späte Chokma, the Joseph story and late wisdom. So it's, of course, a clear allusion to von Rath's article. So according to Levin, the original Joseph story should be qualified as a fairy tale. He calls it in German a Märchen. And this Märchen was later transformed by a redactor whom he calls a Yavist, but this is a Yavist from the exilic or post-exilic time. The Yavist transformed it into a diaspora novella, and then passages that characterize Joseph as a wise and God-fearing man in Genesis 14 to 42 are due to a later wisdom redaction. The redactor responsible for these passages wanted to underline that Joseph's skills in interpreting dreams was given to him by the God of Israel. That's according to Levin. The wisdom at stake in the Joseph story is, according to Levin, späte gesetzesfromme Weisheit, late wisdom which is pious in regards to the Torah. However, an examination of the Joseph narrative shows that Joseph can hardly be characterized as gesetzesfromm, a pious man following the Torah. This wisdom, as I will show, does not presuppose an equation between wisdom and Torah, which is the idea of Levin. First of all, it is difficult to know which laws and narratives of the Pentateuch were known to the author and redactors of the Joseph narrative. The story about Joseph and his brothers clearly presupposes the audience knowledge of the Jacob story and probably also the Exodus narrative. One can even understand the Joseph narrative as kind of a counter narrative to the Exodus narrative, but that's another story. In the first edition of the Joseph story, if the first edition of the Joseph story is to be located in the second half of the Persian period, it's also quite plausible that the author was familiar with some Deuteronomic law and its frame. In this regard, it is interesting, and this is totally an opposite opinion to Levin, that Joseph on several occasions is violating the law. He is acting against the law. First of all, according to Deuteronomy 80:10, no one shall be found among you who practices divination, nachash, the root nachash. And what we have in Genesis 44, verse 5, Joseph uses a silver cup through which he practices divination. And we have exactly the same root, nachash. And this is not criticized at all. Deuteronomy also exhorted his addressees several times not to follow other gods, as for instance in 6:14-15, you shall not follow much after other gods from the gods of the people who are around you. The jealous deity is Yahweh, your God. Or, in the Joseph story, Joseph has no theological problem when Pharaoh speaks of the Egyptian gods. In Genesis 41:25-45, Joseph interprets the king's dreams by stating that God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. And Pharaoh identifies Joseph as having the spirit of the God, or of the gods, Ruach Elohim, and says to him that God has let you know this. Joseph never pronounces the name of Yahweh, and he integrates himself into Egypt's social and religious system. This integration is very extensive. Pharaoh marries Joseph to Asenath, the daughter of the priest of On of Heliopolis, worshipping the sun god Ra. Joseph's mixed marriage stands in clear conflict with the ideology of Deuteronomy, especially 7:1-6, and also Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra 9-10, Nehemiah 13. According to Genesis 41:50-52, Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, are half Egyptians. They are Mamzerim, who according to Deuteronomy 23:2 are not allowed to enter the assembly of Yahweh. No half-breed, no Mamzer shall enter into the assembly of Yahweh. Joseph's second dream, according to which his parents shall bow before him, contradicts the respects due to the parents as formulated in the Decalogue. And when Joseph accuses his brother Benjamin of being a thief, he violates Leviticus 19:11, do not lie to one another. And finally, Joseph does not apply the law of Deuteronomy 24:7 or Exodus 21:16 to his brothers, which stipulates a death penalty for somebody who sells one of his brothers for profit. So I think it's therefore difficult to characterize Joseph and the author of the Joseph narrative as a pious follower of the Torah. The Joseph narratives, on the contrary, expresses a very liberal attitude toward the laws by showing that some laws should be transgressed and others should be subordinated under higher concerns. So Joseph's wisdom is therefore not a wisdom connected to the Torah. In some passages, this wisdom is connected to the God or to the gods, and even places Joseph, and that's very interesting, places Joseph in the role of the divine, as I want to show now. Like in the Masoretic text of Esther, the author of the Joseph story never describes any direct divine intervention. I think that's a very important observation. All comments about God's involvement appears on the lips of the protagonists, Joseph, Jacob, the Pharaoh, or the brothers. Therefore, one can read the story in a totally profane way, or we can also accept the interpretation of Joseph or the other actors. This is, for instance, the case in Genesis 15:20, often considered, as already by Farrar, to be the theological conclusion of the Joseph story. You intended to do bad things to me, but God intended it for good. But just before, when the brothers asked Joseph to forgive them, he answered, "Am I in the place of Elohim, in 1519? In a way, the question remains open, and one may indeed read the narrative as a story about divine providence, but also possibly as a story of a powerful manipulation organized by Joseph in Egypt. The reader may himself ask the question, who is responsible for the reconciliation, the new relationship between Joseph and his brothers? Is it Elohim, God? Is it Joseph? Or both? So Joseph's rise to Egypt, is due to his capacity of dream interpretation. 3 pairs of dreams bring together the first part of the Joseph story in 37, 40, and 41. There is a progression in the way Joseph deals with the dreams. In regard to his own dreams, he only tells them to his family without any interpretation. So the idea is everybody understands the sense of these dreams. As for the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker in 40, he provides interpretation. And then for Pharaoh's dream or dreams, he does not even give the right meaning. He does not only give the right meaning, he also advises the king how to deal with the events that were revealed through these dreams. The confusion between Joseph and the divine sphere is a topic that starts in Joseph's second dream, in which the sun, the moon, and the stars bow down before him. This means that sun, moon, and the stars are under the control of a human being. In the ancient Near East, the celestial bodies are deities. In the Bible, they constitute Yahweh's celestial host, as for instance in Nehemiah 9:6, the host of heaven. In the dream of Genesis 37, which is sometimes considered as a later expansion, but that's not important here, the sun and the moon and the stars prostrate before Joseph as if he were God. When the cupbearer and the baker tell Joseph about their dreams and that there is no one to interpret them, these dreams, Joseph answered, "Is it not to God, to the gods, that interpretations belong? And then tell to me." One may have expected tell to God, but Joseph has taken God's place and established himself as divinely authorized interpreter of these dreams. A similar scenario takes place in the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams in chapter 41. When Joseph interprets the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker, there's still no hint that this capacity is related to wisdom. This changes in 41:8 when Pharaoh calls the diviners and the wise men of Egypt to explain those dreams. The expression Khatumim, which is often translated by magicians, this expression appears only in Genesis 41:8 and 24, and then the priestly passages of the plague narratives and the Daniel narratives. It's apparently an Egyptian loanword designating specialists in liturgical books, as shown already by Vergot. Whereas in the priestly plague narrative, these priests or magicians are competing with the magical skills of Moses and Aaron, they appear in the Joseph and Daniel narratives together with the wise men in their capacity to interpret dreams. In the Joseph story, as well in the beginning of Daniel, they contrast to the Hebrew Judean hero as a narrative foil, since Joseph, like Daniel, are the only one who can understand and explain the royal dreams and visions. Contrary to Exodus 7:9 and Daniel 2:5, very little is made of the failure of Egyptian dream specialists. The focus is on the fact that the real wise man is Joseph. But this wise man firstly tells the Egyptian king that not he, but Elohim will give an answer to the king. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream and there's no one interpret for it. I have heard about you, you hear a dream and in order to interpret it. And Joseph answered to Pharaoh, not me, Elohim will answer favorably, or however one should translate, shalom, to Pharaoh. So the one who interprets and gives advice is Joseph, representing the God on whom Pharaoh and Joseph agree. Once Joseph has explained Pharaoh's dream, or the two parts of the dream, he immediately makes a suggestion on how to respond to the message of these dreams. And now may Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise, Nabon v'chakam, and set him over the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said to the servants, can one find a man like this one, in whom is the spirit of the gods, of the God? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has let you know all this, there's no one discerning and wise as you. You will be over my house. Also, the root Chakam appears across the whole Joseph story and the whole book of Genesis only here. There is no need to consider these verses as being part of a wisdom reduction, because without this passage, it's difficult to understand Joseph's rise. So Joseph participates in this rise by suggesting that Pharaoh should establish a wise man. Pharaoh takes up this suggestion, applying it to Joseph. So is this divine providence? Or is this a result of a very clever Joseph? Or is it both? Joseph is presented as the real wise man compared to the wise men of Egypt. In order to strengthen this statement, the root Chakam is linked here with Navon. This double expression also appears in 1 Kings 3:12, where God promises to give Solomon a wise and discerning heart. It's not impossible that the author was influenced by this passage and wanted to present Joseph as a forerunner of the wise King Solomon, to whom God spoke in a dream, 1 Kings 3:5-14. Both roots, wise and discerning, also appear together in other texts, in Proverbs, as in Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Hosea, in order to characterize the real wise individuals, and in Deuteronomy 4:6, in order to present the people as wise. In some cases, as observed by Jean-Marie Husser, this wisdom refers to the royal court and the royal counselor, which may also explain this use in the context of Joseph's rise at Pharaoh's court. In summary, Genesis 14:41, Joseph's wisdom is used to present him as having mantic powers that enable him to become second in command after Pharaoh. Contrary to Daniel, whose wisdom is related in Daniel 6:6 to the law of God, Dat Eloah, Joseph's God is also Pharaoh's God, which inspires and enables him to be a good interpreter and a wise counselor. In 42:18, Joseph presents himself as to his brothers who are unaware of his real identity as the God-fearer. Joseph said to them on the third day, do this and you will live. The deity or the gods, High Elohim, I fear. The fear of God, or the fear of Yahweh, is a refrain that occurs in all parts of the book of Proverbs, which opens in 1:7 with the statement, the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge, wisdom and instruction. Wisdom and instruction. Wisdom and instruction fools despise. Joseph, who still presents himself to his brothers here as an Egyptian, does not use the tetragrammaton, but the international Elohim. In several wisdom texts, the fear of God, of Yahweh, denotes an ethical statement aiming for the conservation of life. This is, for instance, the case in the story of the Egyptian midwives in Exodus 1:15-21, whose fear of God, also with Ha Elohim, as here in Genesis 24:18, motivates them to violate the king's order to kill the new Hebrew males. And the comparison of Proverbs 14:27 and 13:14 shows that the fear of God, or the fear of Yahweh, is identical to the instruction of wisdom. The fear of Yahweh is a fountain of life to avoid the snares of death, 14:27, and the Torah of the wise is a fountain of life to avoid the snares of death, in 13:14. But in these cases, the term Torah does not refer to the law of the Pentateuch, but to general teaching or instruction. It may be, as some scholars have argued, that the presentation of Joseph as fearing the God in 42:18b may be a later insertion in order to connect Joseph more closely to the central idea of the book of Proverbs. In fact, as you can see, we can read 24:18a especially together with 19 without necessarily having the fear of God. On the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here where you are imprisoned. The rest of you shall go," and so on. So this wisdom attitude, even if it's an insert, is still international and not Torah-centered. And I think the same holds true for Joseph's behavior in Genesis 39, to which I would like to come back now. Also, some scholars postulate that Genesis 39, the seduction of Joseph by his Egyptian mistress, was part of the original Joseph story. There are many reasons to consider this chapter as a supplementation, even a twofold supplementation of the original story. The story of Joseph's resistance to the sexual advances of his master's wife and her false accusations that lead to his arrest is framed by two passages that emphasize Joseph's essence. First, in the house of the master, who put him in charge of his whole household in verse 1-6, and at the end in prison, 21-23. All the mentions of Yahweh occur within these frames, and the parallels between verse 1-6 and 21-23 is reinforced by the use of the root salach in 2, 3, and 23, as well by the use of the substantive chen, favor, in 4 and 21. Also, Genesis 39, in its present context, prepares in a way Joseph's surgeon in jail. The chapter does not fit smoothly in the context. Following the false accusation of his master's wife, Joseph is thrown in prison, probably in order to wait for judgment. At the end of the story, however, curiously, Joseph, because of Yahweh, finds so much favor in the sight of the chief's jailer that he gives him everything under his authority in his hand, so that Joseph is bestowed with a similar position that he received in verse 4, where he is established over his house, al-Habayit. Both scenarios do not fit with the beginning of chapter 14. In this narrative, Joseph interprets a dream of the chief cupbearer, the baker. He is neither a prisoner nor the overseer of the jail. He is, according to 44, the servant of the chief of the guard, who charges him with the royal prisoners in order to be at their service. That means that there was an original transition from 37 to 40 with very few elements from 31. The idea is that the one who bought Joseph is in fact the guardian of the prison. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. The chief of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. Joseph found favor in his sight and waited him. And sometimes after this, Pharaoh became angry with his two officers, and he put them in custody in the house of the chief of the guard. And the chief of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he waited on them, and they continued for some time in custody. So in the original story, there are not two different masters of Joseph. It's already the responsible of the prison who is buying him from the Ishmaelites. Though there are other indications to consider Genesis 39 as a case of supplementation. First of all, the theme of the dreams that structure the first part of the Joseph narratives are now interrupted by this chapter. We can also observe some stylistic differences. For instance, the preposition que, which is followed by an infinitive, occurs in the whole Joseph story 5 times in this chapter 39 and only twice elsewhere. 50% of all the usages of the expression Vayehi are concentrated here in this chapter. And the preposition ba'asher, because, only occurs in 39, 9, 23, whereas in the other parts we have ka'asher. And finally, it has also often been observed that Joseph's encounter with the Egyptian woman has no real conclusion, because the lie of the woman remains undiscovered and unpunished, in contrast to the crime committed by Joseph's brothers. In the whole Joseph narrative, the episode of Genesis 39 is never alluded to. There's almost no doubt that the author of Genesis 39 found his inspiration in the Egyptian tale of the 2 brothers, an idea on which most commentators would agree. Of course, the motive of the spurned wife is quite common and occurs in the legend, among many others, the legend of Bellerophon, Hippolytus, and others. But the parallel between Genesis 39 and the Egyptian tale, of which only one manuscript is conserved, are much closer. Both contain the motive of clothes, also used differently. In the Egyptian tale, the woman speaks to Bata, the younger brother, the Joseph of this tale, quite similarly as in Genesis 39, and also tries to grasp him. She got up, took hold of him, and said to him, "Come, let us sleep together." And Bata delivers a quite similar speech as Joseph, qualifying the woman's proposal as this great wrong that you said to me. And likewise, in Genesis 39, the woman perverts the events in the presence of her husband by taking up Bata's speech as if she would have protested. In contrast to Genesis 39, the tale of the 2 brothers is a very complicated and a long mythological text, which legitimates Bata as a future pharaoh. The author of Genesis 39 has only taken over the first part of the tale. Also, it can be argued that the Joseph story is also about Joseph Ascent. He's not becoming the pharaoh, but he's becoming second to the pharaoh. And contrary to Genesis 39, Anpu, the elder brother, learns that his wife has cheated him and then will punish her by killing her. So as I said, the tale exists so far only in the d'Orbigny papyrus, which is from the New Kingdom. But this cannot be used as an argument, as it was sometimes, that Genesis 39 must be very old, since an allusion to Bata and his castrations are also mentioned in the papyrus Jumilak, which was written in the Ptolemaic period. That means that the tale was still known in Persian and Hellenistic times. So if the author had access to this tale, it seems likely that he was familiar with Egyptian literature. He used this tale of 2 brothers for several reasons. First of all, he transforms Joseph with this story into a model of loyalty and chastity, in presenting him as the ideal young lad who follows the exhortations of the first book of Proverbs, which constantly warns against the foreign woman. I have here a kind of comparison between Genesis 39 and Proverbs 7. And I don't want to make you fall asleep in reading all these texts. I just want you to have a look on this text, and you can see that in Proverbs 7 we have elements that are put into narrations in the story on Genesis 39. She seizes him, kisses him with impudent face. She said to him, "I've decked my couch with covering colored spreads of Egyptian linen. Come, let us take our fill of love. My husband is not at home," which much seductive speaks, she persuades him, and so on and so on. So I will just have you like a little look on this, and later you can check it with your own Bibles. but I think we should go on. The idea of this is to say that the author of Genesis 39 was familiar with this text and probably other texts from the first part of the book of Proverbs, especially chapter 2 and chapter 5, but also 6:20 to 35 and others. And these chapters are, if I follow Ben Schipper or others, are dated to the late Persian or early Hellenistic periods. So if we take the Genesis 39 in parallel to those texts, we can see that Joseph appears then as following the advice of the first part of the book of Proverbs. So Joseph's answer to the Egyptian wife in verse 9 has been understood by Christoph Levin and then by Franziska Eding as belonging to a gesetzesorientierte Bearbeitung. But the only reference to the law that I can find is Deuteronomy 22:22 to 24. But even here, we have no indication of a direct quotation. Adultery was just as stigmatized in Egypt as in the ancient Levant and in Mesopotamia. And we heard about it earlier, it's always the fault of the woman. The expression great wickedness and sin against the deity refers more to the episode of Abimelech in Genesis 20, who wants to sleep with Sarah in Genesis 29. And this is qualified as a big sin. And we can, of course, again, come back to the Egyptian tale of the two brothers. So the author of the first version of Genesis 39 wanted to present Joseph's wisdom differently in Genesis 40 than in Genesis 40:41 by presenting Joseph in the light of the book of Proverbs, but not exclusively, since the danger of seduction also appears in the tale of the two brothers and in the instruction of Ani. Joseph's wisdom behavior remains international, and when he speaks to his master's wife, he refers to Elohim and to a general taboo against adultery. This changes, however, through the intervention of a Yahwistic redactor who was somewhat unhappy with the exclusive use of Elohim in the Joseph story. And he introduces in Genesis 39 the name of the God of Israel 8 times. 8 times we have Yahweh and nowhere else in the Joseph story. He emphasizes that in contrast to the original Joseph novella, Yahweh was present in Egypt from the very beginning and not only protected Joseph, but also blessed the Egyptians who were friendly to Joseph. So I come to a conclusion. Von Rath's theory about the Joseph story as a didactic and wisdom novella needs some modification. The Joseph story is above all a diaspora novella that nevertheless integrated sapiential elements into the story. Joseph's rise, due to his capacity to interpret the dreams of the royal officers, is characterized by the narrator as a wisdom coming directly from Elohim. It is a mantic wisdom of sorts. In the first edition of the Joseph story, there is deliberate confusion between Joseph and Elohim, because the narratives can be understood on 2 levels: a story of divine intervention, or a story of a skilled and smart Joseph who, in regard to his brothers, behaves like Elohim. Or maybe you can understand them on both levels at the same time. A later revision of the Joseph story stressed the ethical dimension of this wisdom by introducing the concept of the fear of God and by demonstrating, in light of Proverbs 7 and other texts from the Proverbs, Joseph's loyalty and chastity in Genesis 39. But even then, Joseph's wisdom remains international, since he also confirms in this regard to Egyptian text, as already and rightly observed by Gerhard von Rath. The constant use of Elohim, with the exception of the late Yahwistic revision of Genesis 39, contributes to the international flair of this narrative. In many cases, there is possibly a double entendre, as Elohim can refer to God of Israel as well as to the gods of Egypt. And there's no need for Joseph and the Egyptians to quarrel, to have theological confrontations about the identity of Elohim. I think in the current time, this is maybe a message that we can hear. The wisdom elements in the Joseph story should therefore not be qualified as related to the Torah, but to a more larger idea of wisdom. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions or critiques. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.